Well, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today as we talk with Andrew Jefford about his new book, Drinking with the Valkyries. I'm Jessica Sculley. I'm the director of Commonwealth Wine School, and we're also joined by Kim Simone, who's a French wine scholar, and she's the manager of our school here.
Hello.
So originally from England, now residing in France, Andrew has been described as a poet, a philosopher, and the most thoughtful person we have writing about wine, according to Randall Graham of Bonnie Doon, who's a philosopher of wine himself. He's been able to combine a passion for wine and for writing since the 1980s, and since then has worked as a freelance drinks journalist and broadcaster, in particular for the Evening Standard and for BBC Radio 4. He's written 12 books and guides, including the widely admired The New France, Peat, Smoke and Spirit, and in September of this year, Drinking with the Valkyries. He's been a contributing editor and columnist for Decanter magazine, freelance beverage contributor to newspapers and magazines throughout the English-speaking world, too numerous to name, as well as countless radio programs, blogs, and journals. Andrew Jefford, we're so pleased to be speaking with you today about your new book. And for those of you who are joining us at home, please feel free to use the chat to ask questions throughout this entire conversation, and we will do our very best to get to them. So I think since we're talking about this wonderful new book of yours, which is a collection of, I would say, short pieces that you've written over the years, can you tell us a little bit about your decision to write this book and some of the themes that you wanted to get across to your readers?
Sure. Well, I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years with bits of journalism in various places, some of it short, some of it longer. I always try and make every piece I write for every different destination written in a different way. So I very much, have an idea in my mind about what the Decanter reader is, what the Decanter online reader is, what the World of Fine Wine reader is, and so on and so forth. And I always felt in myself that there was probably the chance, the possibility to make an interesting collection out of some of these pieces. I didn't really know if anybody was going to run with me on that. I mentioned it to a few people, and occasionally I got some encouraging comments, and then it would disappear into the long grass and nothing had happened for a bit. Anyway, to cut a long story short, eventually Académie du Vin Publishing, the publisher I published it with today, came good, and they said, yeah, let's do it. We like the idea. And so we put it all together. Then, of course, the question came, well, out of all this huge body of material, what are you actually going to choose? And that was quite a challenging experience. And in the end, I decided that there were really 2 or 3 main criteria. One was that it obviously shouldn't be over ephemeral. Quite a lot of wine journalism is ephemeral. It's not really about anything other than the topics of the moment. So I set all of the topics of the moment aside. Another criterion was the fact that it shouldn't be too geeky. It's quite easy to pick up on wine columns that really drill down deeply into particular technical topics, but I don't think they're of any great interest to the general reader. And I did want to interest the general reader with the material I chose. So those were the kind of tools of exclusion, if you like. And then the tools of inclusion were, I particularly wanted to keep the pieces that were stories. I particularly wanted to emphasize the human interest, the experience of drinking as much as anything else. I particularly wanted to come up with some topics that were controversial in some way or other, or which challenged the accepted order, because I think that's always worthwhile doing. And then there were also a few longer pieces which I really felt I wanted to include because they meant a lot to me personally. One of them is the opening piece, which looks at the work of Patrick McGovern, a wonderful body of work examining the most distant traces that we can find about people making wine and drinking wine. I thought that was an interesting scene setter. There's another sort of quite a philosophically rich, I hope, essay towards the end, which I wanted to include, called Wine and Astonishment, because that to me is the sort of philosophical underpinning of everything I try to do. There's a piece about comparing wine and tea. And there's another piece called Wine is Also a Dream, which was originally the piece I wanted to use as the title piece for the book. In the end, the publishers decided they'd rather have Drinking with the Valkyries. But Wine is Also a Dream was a piece that was provoked by a comment that Philippe Guigal made when I was there with students in the Rhone Valley, up above the town of Ampuy, in the villages, in the vineyards of Côte-Rôtie. And he was talking about, technical this and technical that and this and that and the other. And then he just stopped and paused and said, but wine is also a dream. And he didn't say any more than that. And I went away to the hotel room and I thought about it. And the more I thought about it, suddenly the more I could see exactly what it was he meant. In other words, if everything you were going to drink over the next year, let's say, was all delivered to you in a little plastic medical sample bottle with a number on it, just a code, and that was all you were going to drink for the next year, I don't think you'd really enjoy your wine drinking very much, because there isn't any hinterland behind wine delivered in that way. Yes, of course, the actual aromas and flavors are very important, and some will be better than others under those circumstances. But if you strip away all the cultural depth, all of the long-term cultural depth as well as short-term cultural depth, everything we know about wine, the label, the bottle, everything we know about the place that it came from, and just strip all that dream residuum away and just leave you with the liquid itself, it wouldn't be very enjoyable. So that was another, for me, very significant piece. Anyway, that's rather a long answer, Jessica, but it just gives you, I hope, a little insight into the way that we did put the book together.
No, I love that. And I love I think it comes through not just in the article that you wrote of Wine as a Dream, but I think it comes through the book, how much of wine is wrapped up in its history and its culture. I mean, obviously, we're a bunch of students of wine, I think, for the most part, people who are here, and we're pretty good at geeking out about a lot of the stuff that you could, about the chemistry and about geography and about soil structures and grape varieties and everything that they bring to the wine. But coming back to probably how did we all get started in this, and why did we start to be interested in this in the first place? I think it does come back to that very fundamental idea of wine as this dream. Yeah. So let me ask you a question that you've no doubt been asked a million times before. How did you get started in all of this? What was the dream for you at the very beginning when you got into this drinks business?
Sure. Well, the initial way I got into wine was I grew up in the family of a clergyman. My dad, used to buy a bottle of cider for Sunday lunch. We didn't have a lot of money, so there wasn't any elaborate wine cellar or anything like that. I had two brothers, still have, very fond of them. So there were 3 or 4 men in the family, and then my poor mum, who was outnumbered. But I decided when I got to the age of 16 or so that, we just one bottle of cider for Sunday lunch, we could do better than that. So I started making wine myself using grape juice concentrate and country ingredients like nettles and elderflower and carrots and those sort of things. And I bought all these demijohns and brewed this stuff up, and it would be plop, plop, plopping in the back of the room when we watched TV of an evening. And then suddenly we had more wine to drink with our meals, and it seemed to me a sort of a great improvement on the life we had before. I'm exaggerating a bit, but that was what got me interested in the process. And then sorry?
Did it taste good? What you made?
It didn't mostly. It didn't taste very good. Definitely not as good as what you could buy if you bought a good bottle of almost anything. But it wasn't catastrophically bad either. I mean, it was just about drinkable, and it was good fun, and everybody, they teased me for it, and it just added a bit of merriment and lifted those meal times and made them a bit more feast-like than they were before, which is really what wine does. But you mentioned, talking a little bit about the sort of unlocking the dream, as it were, and that really went to a little bit later in my life. When I left school, before I went to university, I had a year off. With my then girlfriend, I worked in a mental hospital as a nursing assistant. So that meant I had a little bit of money. And since we were in nurses' quarters, we didn't have to spend anything on our upkeep, as it were. So it was sort of pocket money. And I just remember going out and buying bottles of wine and buying books on wine as well. I remember I bought André Simone's Wine Primer, Peter Sichel's Penguin Book of Wine. We're going back, 40 years or so, an awfully long time, even more than that. And I just remember sitting in the nurses' quarters in this mental hospital near Norwich with a glass of Chianti and just suddenly realizing that everything I was drinking had come out of vineyard soils in Tuscany. I was drinking Tuscany to some extent. And that to me was an enormously exciting realization. And it in many ways, it's still at the core of what fascinates me about wine. Yes, I mean, I'm very, very interested in terroir in a geeky kind of way, of course. I didn't want to include a lot of that in the book, but that is also true. But the fundamental driver of this particular passion and fascination is that basic notion that you are drinking sort of earth juice, in fermented earth juice when you drink a glass of wine, and it comes from a place on earth. And the place that it comes from, plus of course the variety, is what distinguishes it from every other wine you might buy. I remember buying Rosé d'Anjou as well, and that was a completely different wine from a completely different place. Bordeaux, of course, back in the day, basic Bordeaux. And all of these were earth juice from different places. And I found that limitlessly fascinating as well. And that really got me off on reading all about it and beginning to explore it from there.
That's so interesting. So I think when you think of wine as sort of this earth juice and we're drinking this place, it also comes back to a theme I feel like you talked about a lot, which is tasting and how well we really do it, and under what circumstances we do it. And I think as students of wine, we've probably all spent a whole lot of time at least practicing blind tasting and working on our blind tasting. And we do it in this very kind of sterile and clinical environment, either of the classroom or in an examination setting, or maybe even as judges. But you talk a lot about how bad we are at it, really, how bad even we are as experts. So can you talk a little bit more about tasting and drinking this earth juice and under, the circumstances, I guess, as we contemplate its importance that we do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't say we do it badly. Perhaps we don't always meet our own expectations in terms of diagnostics or whatever. But I wouldn't say we do it badly. I mean, I think everybody is different in this respect. Taste is, in the end, subjective. We all taste in a different way, just as we all see and hear in a different way and think in a different way. It's part of our uniqueness. But what I really want to emphasize in the book is what I truly feel is that the wine world has become very sort of hierarchical, very points dominated, very structured. We have this colossal sort of pyramid of glory of wines, right up to the unobtainable, crazily expensive, exquisitely beautiful, we always think, wines at the very top, and trickle down to sort of wines that we rather despise at the bottom because they're modest, or they're made by cooperatives, or they're from the wrong vintage, or they only have 85 points instead of 89 points, or whatever. And to me, all of that sort of sense of hierarchy is actually inimical to people's personal experience of tasting wine. I mean, I know from my own experience that, I get, because I'm working in the business, I get to taste, high scoring wines a lot of the time, drink them too. But I'm often quite disappointed compared to more modest wines because they're just not what I'm looking for at that particular time, or those particular flavors maybe tick somebody's buttons, but they don't, or push somebody's buttons, but they don't particularly push mine. I do feel that we as it were underestimate and almost auto denigrate our own tastes in all of this. And I feel that, this sort of hierarchy that we're having shoved down our throats the whole time with the whole point system is actually, as I say, completely false to most people's experience of wine. And one of the things I would like I hope the book encourages people to do is to yeah, I mean, we're not going to get rid of points. Of course, they serve a useful purpose. They're kind of shorthand for the enthusiasm of whoever's allotting the points, but they're not any more use than that. And I think sometimes they're regarded with far too much reverence and sanctity. And I would like to encourage people to tear them up, turn them upside down, shake them all over the table, rattle them around, kick them around the floor, and then, you know, come up with your own personal hierarchy, which is actually much more useful to you and may not be anything like as expensive as you think it's going to be, and will be infinitely more rewarding. You know, to me, the thing that really is interesting about wine is difference. It's not excellence, because excellence is subjectively perceived. And I don't, you know, I'm not particularly interested in other people's excellences. To me, it's difference that's the really exciting thing. So once again, I would like to encourage people through some of the essays in the book to explore and embrace difference above all as the means of decoding and breaking down and beginning to understand and exploring and enjoying the wine world. To me, that is really what the final emphasis always needs to be: difference and not excellence.
I love that in the book, especially when you're talking about particular bottles of wine that you've tried or tasted, you are very much steering away from a recommendation, and instead you're really talking about a story of your experience drinking this wine. Do you feel like, as a writer and as a very renowned wine journalist, I imagine you have a lot of people coming up to you saying, "What should I drink? What should I drink? What should I drink?" Maybe, yes. Or maybe you don't. I mean, maybe you don't get that a lot in person because your medium is print. But how do you respond to that? Do you give people recommendations, or do you just say, "Hey, find out what you like and go with it"?
Well, if I'm personally talking to the person, if we're having a face-to-face interaction, a conversation, then immediately I will begin to talk to them about their own tastes and what they enjoy and what they like. It's you know, when people write to me, I mean, not often, people don't often write and say, "Look, you know, I've got $50, it's my birthday next week, you know, what should I buy?" They're kind enough not to bombard me with those kind of queries. And in any case, you know, they're not short of advice from here, there, and everywhere, and above all, the famous points. So it's pretty easy to go out and chase a point or two if you want to. But what I perhaps just to go back to the book, I mean, the pieces that you mentioned there tend to be from World of Fine Wine magazine. Okay, the name is World of Fine Wine magazine. Maybe I'm meant to be writing up fine wines the whole time, but actually I don't have a cellar full of fine wines. And the editor, a good friend of mine, Dr. Neil Beckett, is kind enough to allow me to write what I want about pretty much any wine. So quite a lot of the pieces from that I've picked out from that particular column for the book are either quite modest wines, including things like Petit Chablis or Picpoul de Pinet, or really quite obscure wines, which I'm not expecting people to actually be able to track down and find and taste for themselves, like a wine called Terron from Croatia, for example, or another particular one from Sardinia. But what I want to do in those pieces is, as it were, take people on the little tasting journey that I've been on with those wines. Not to tell them you must go out and buy this, not to say this producer's better than every other producer, not to say that this vintage is the one to go for, but to say, okay, you know, here's a wine in a glass, here's where it comes from. I found out a little about this, just as anybody else, just as anybody reading can do. And this is the sort of the way it's set light to my imagination, because I think that is very, very important. That is super rewarding. If when you drink a wine, you can have your imagination ignited in that kind of way, that really is a meaningful and enriching experience, much more so than just discussing whether it truly merits 93 points or whether it really should be 91 points or 89 points. You know, to really engage with the wine imaginatively. That's what I really would like people to do. So those little pieces in the book are really to sort of try and take people on that kind of journey, the journey I've been able to go down with some of those wines. Perhaps, and I would hope, you know, to encourage them to view wine in the same kind of way and to make similar journeys for themselves when they come across other wines that they might come across. After all, none of us are going to come across the same wines. This is another thing that strikes me as completely extraordinary about the modern wine world, people are signing up to the Wine Advocate or any of the other big reviewing websites because there are, I forget what the figure is, but 200,000 tasting notes or 300,000 tasting notes or whatever. But what the hell are you going to do with all of those? You're never going to taste even a fraction of 1% of those wines. You're never going to come across them. You're never going to be able to afford them. You're never going to actually find them in your cellar. Anyway, you haven't got enough room for them in your cellar. Whatever, all of this other stuff that is real life that really kind of conditions most of our drinking. To me, it's setting off on the wrong track. It's that discovery, that ignition of the imagination that to me is the important thing, and that's what I hope some of the pieces in the book will stir people into doing.
Well, I think it comes back to this whole idea of wine as a dream, right? And what it's actually conjuring in us in the first place. When you were writing about that, about this dream force of wine, I think you're also talking pretty explicitly about intoxication, right? And what that does to us. So would you talk a little bit, you had mentioned at the beginning how you wanted to begin the book with the historical perspective, the rather long article, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, about sort of the history of wine and humankind. Can you speak a little bit to that, about sort of our wine is genetically imprinted on us, actually?
Well, yes, I mean, we acquired the genetic wherewithal to be able to digest ethanol quite early on in our evolution, maybe even back at the primate stage. So, it's obviously something that, and we see this behavior in primates nowadays, in the wild as well. Rotting, fermenting fruit has a particular effect on the animals that consume it. And, ever since we discovered the effect it could have on us, we've been trying to reproduce that experience for ourselves. And now we manage to do it with obviously what is enormous sophistication and complexity. I do think that the presence of alcohol, which is, again, sometimes something that wine writers and wine commentators almost seem to regret in a strange sort of way, oh dear, this wine is, I quite like this wine, but gosh, it's 14.5. It would be so much better if it was 12.5 or 11.5. Or even if it didn't, almost implying that it would be better if it didn't have any alcohol at all. And to me, that's a complete misunderstanding. The alcohol is obviously it's an essential constituent of the flavor, and wines without alcohol don't taste the same at all. But it also, wine is a mind-altering substance. And that is a very precious part, really, of the imaginative charge that it can bring us, the dream force that it can bring us. So to me, those are very, very important things. And if wine didn't have that, it wouldn't be the same at all. And by the way, wine has it in a very special, intricate, complex, compelling sort of way. I mean, there are plenty of, you could all drink neat vodka if you want and have exactly the same ethanol effect. But of course, the drinking experience will be completely different. Not only would you not have any of that dream force, but you don't also have any of the extraordinary aromatic and flavor complexity that you get with wine. So there's no doubt in my mind that, I love beer and I love whiskey and I love other drinks, cognac, all fantastic. But there is something very, very special and compelling about wine, which is why it has the reputation it does and why people struggle so hard in so many places around the world to make it. So yes, the presence of alcohol is something very important and very precious to wine. And I think we would be well advised to, to embrace that a little bit more than we do. Something else I'm very keen to emphasize is the importance of drinking rather than merely tasting. And something else that seems to me very dangerous about the hierarchies of the modern wine world is that almost all of them are established on the basis of people making tasting notes and then allotting scores on the basis of what they've tasted without necessarily drinking. And I think all of us know that, you can taste a wine and it can taste absolutely wonderful and super exciting. And then you sit down and spend some time with it. And, by the end of the first glass, you're tiring a bit and you just can't manage the second or the third glass. Whereas all the great wines, certainly the great wines in the European tradition, are all extraordinarily drinkable. And you may be a little bit underwhelmed by the first glass. You may not have that much to write in your tasting note, but by the third glass, you're on much, much better terms with the wine, and you truly understand and appreciate the way it works as a drinking object. And I think those things are very, very important too. So that's also, the reason why I emphasize as much as possible, not merely tasting, but drinking too. A tasting note is a hypothesis, but it's not really validated until you've drunk the wine. The drinking of the wine is the proof. And after you've drunk and tasted, and if you still think it's wonderful at the end of that, then it really is wonderful.
To that end, can you, for people who may not have read this section in your book yet, can you retell the story of the wine that you gave sort of a kind of a not very highly regarded review to, and then had a different experience with later on?
Yes, well, I mean, this all cropped up to do with, the issue of Brett in wine, and that's something else interesting as well. What the wine world calls faults, are they faults or are they just characteristics of the wine? There's no doubt in the mind of most winemakers, and I think there are fairly good reasons for this, that excessive Brett when it becomes the dominant note in a wine is something that is unsatisfactory and finally truly a failure. But when there is an element of that as a complexing factor, then it can be very different. You see exactly the same in the beer world. There's a Belgian beer called, two beer styles in the Belgian beer world called Gers and Lambic. Those are spontaneously fermented beers made near Brussels. And the main yeast involved in fermenting those is Brettanomyces yeast. So if they don't have Brett character, then they're not true to style. They're not what the drinkers of those beers actually are looking for. So these things are all to some extent subjective in themselves. But that particular wine was it was actually a tasting of Napa Valley blends and Cabernet-led blends. It was one that I didn't particularly notice it when I went by it. I gave it a fairly good note. And the other tasters ditto. It didn't come out as a top scoring wine. And then I saw what it was afterwards, and because it's Cane 5 and I knew Chris Howell very well, and I sort of wrote to him and said, look, I'm sorry I didn't give this a very good note. Feel a bit bad about that. And of course, Chris is somebody who very much believes in a little bit of Brett sometimes being a useful complexing factor, and not simply evoking horse blankets or farmyards, but also evoking things like, truffles and mushrooms and that sort of thing as well. But he was completely chilled about it. And he wrote back and said, no problem. this happens in tastings of that sort. And in any case, what really matters is not the tasting, but the drinking. So I got hold of another bottle of this wine. And I took it off and drunk it with two very good friends who are not in the wine world at all. And they're called Stuart and Zoe cooks super well, and they love to talk about wines, but they don't know all the debates. They're not geeks. They're not, coming with a parti pris, with a pre-existing opinion about things. And I served that together with Napa Nook, which is the second wine from Dominus, which I thought would be a good point of comparison, because Christian Weck certainly isn't making super fruity wines above all. He's also has very much the European ideal behind his winemaking too. And we just tried these two wines, and in the end, my two friends both preferred the Cane 5 and talked about it. And it was the sort of savory side of the thing that they really liked. The Napa Nook, which is the second wine of Dominus, didn't have that to the same extent, because it was the simpler fruit that had been picked probably from the younger vines for the second wine. And it was a super interesting, really illustration of the way that actually when you sit down and drink a wine, you can see a completely different wine to the wine you saw when you whooshed past it in a tasting with a lot of other much more showy wines. And that for me both made that lesson, underscored that lesson for me, but also underscored the lesson that sometimes, over cleanliness in winemaking and the scrupulous exclusion of faults and a certain searching after technical perfection in a wine can also strip all the interest out of a wine as well. Very much try and be as human as possible in my response to wines. And to me, that means embracing you know, what is it the Japanese say, wasi sabi, you know, the things that are slightly imperfect in an object, in a sensual object, can often be those that incline you towards thinking that, yes, this really is very, very good.
Mm-hmm. And I think also, sorry, Kim, go ahead.
I think that this, brings out to me something you said at the very beginning, where, really it comes down to the joy, the joy of drinking wine, the joy of sharing it with others. And one of the themes that I felt I saw throughout this entire book was that sense of surprise, when we view things, and especially, from our perspective, where we're coming from a center of wine education, where we do all these certifications, it is more of that clinical, you have to kind of stick to the rubric. When we see these things that maybe are a little bit different, or not what we're expecting, or are not necessarily true to form, on the one hand, we might not be able to score them as well, because they're, not following the rules necessarily, but they do bring that interest, and they do bring that, bit of discovery and surprise. And it seemed to me that the pieces in this book where you show that joy and that, love of discovery is when you are tasting and drinking with other people. And so, I like that whole idea of camaraderie, of sharing wine, and, talking about it with, maybe not even people who are in the wine industry, but just that have an interest and have that love there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I agree that that's very important. And, that's why I love, you're quite right that in the scholastic environment, of course, you have to, stick to the script to some extent. And of course, when you're trying to teach tasting, you need parameters, and you need boundaries. You need to understand where things stop and start. You need to hook on to the hooks that you can in order to make some sense of it. But once again, it's a bit like the scores. I just say that, yeah, all of that's great. We need to acquire these skills. All of these things are useful, but don't make it the be all and end all. Don't take it so seriously that we actually exclude the unpredictable and the strange and the more human parts of the whole experience.
How do you view sort of formal wine education? It seems like most of your experience has come from the doing and the tasting, and not necessarily the sitting with a book and learning how to taste through doing it, kind of in a classroom setting.
Yes, well, I mean, it's true that, shockingly enough, I have no formal wine training at all. So everything I have learned, I've really sort of learned on the job. But I still have huge admiration and respect for those who do go right the way up through the wine education ladder, right the way up to Master of Wine at the top. It so happens I never had the possibility of doing that for one reason or another, but I have huge admiration, as I say, for those who do. And I am involved in wine education with the Wine Scholar Guild. So I really enjoy that work. I love helping people discover. I love, leading wine tours, which I've just done 3 weeks of in October, for example. All of that is great fun because, I always discover with other people discovering. You never, something else I'm very unhappy with or try to avoid wherever possible is the notion of the master and the student. I don't really like the term master much as it's widely applied to wine. It's very embedded now. I'm not sure we're ever going to scrape it away, but I wish we could find some other way of expressing skill and scholarship rather than that particular term. Because I hate the idea of ever telling people, from the top down to the bottom that this is the way things are, because all of my experience of learning about wine is that almost everything I've ever learned about wine and thought, yes, okay, I get it, now this is true. Sooner or later, you're going to meet a winemaker who's going to say, actually, no, it's not quite like that. Let me show you the way I do it. And then you discover they're doing it a completely different way. And the result is also very interesting. So, in the end, there are very few really, truly hard and fast rules in wine. It is an enormously complex equation always, and it doesn't have one particular formula or one particular outcome. So again, I always try and stay, even in the education work, to be as open-minded and as flexible and as curious as possible, and to discover with people rather than telling them the way it is. That's the way I try and do things.
And wine is kind of an art that way. You talk about, is it a product? Is it a craft? Is it an art? You have this theme throughout the book of wine as a commodity and, something to market, and the whole, idea of various levels of expense, and then those wines are out of reach. But that really does, speak to the craftsmanship and how something like wine can be viewed in so many different ways, not just as, a product, but as, almost like an art form. Yes.
I mean, I think we have to be quite careful, and when we say, the art of wine, or wine is an art, wine is not art, because it's not the total product of the human mind. When a poet sits down to write a poem, they have a blank sheet of paper and it all comes out of their head. And ditto when a painter sits down to paint a painting, or a musician, a composer sits down to create a piece of music. Wine is really craft, because you're taking a product and you're fashioning it. You're taking it through the adventure of the metamorphosis of fermentation into a finished, stable product. So it's craftsmanship. But the interesting thing about wine is that we tend to appreciate it in the same kind of way that we appreciate works of art. That is true. We appreciate it aesthetically. And because wine is so gloriously complex and rewarding, it doesn't seem pretentious to do that. It might seem pretentious, to talk about breakfast cereals or burgers in that kind of way. But actually, it doesn't seem pretentious to talk about wine in that way, because all of our experience is that it really does have enormous richness and nuance, much as a work of art has enormous richness and nuance. But the thing that I'm not going to say deplore, but I regret about wine, of course, is what I call in another of the essays in the book, wine's transactional flaw, which is that actually it's very inexpensive to appreciate great works of art. You can buy the complete works of William Shakespeare for, a couple of dollars if you want, or Joyce's Ulysses, or any book of poetry, or you can admire paintings for nothing at all when you can go into galleries for free, as you can, for example, in the UK. Whereas to truly appreciate the highest achievements of wine craftsmanship in that kind of aesthetic way, you do need a huge amount of money. And even to appreciate, let's take champagne, for example. To appreciate any sort of champagne, you need quite a lot of money. A bottle of champagne is $30 plus. And for a lot of people, that is an awful lot of money, particularly at the moment, to try and find. So that for me is a slight flaw with wine. In order to be able to engage with it, you need money, and to engage with it at the highest level, and you need an awful lot of money. And that is to some extent exclusionary. It has to be. And so I sort of regret that. That's not true of appreciating works of art in the same kind of way. But there you are. That's the way it is. We have to live with that. And of course, that's not to say that there aren't plenty of wines which are much less expensive that we can also appreciate and enjoy in the same way as we enjoy works of art as well. So it's not a fatal flaw, but it is a flaw.
I think that's true. Certainly in the art market as well, if you're going to possess something and be the only one to possess it, as I guess you are with a bottle of wine, you pay for that. But it's for something that's an agricultural product, it's so much more the norm in wine than anything that we deal with, even in terms of food, except I guess even at the highest levels. If you want to walk into a 3-star Michelin restaurant, you pay for that work of art as well, which is, can you think of a way that we could overcome that to a degree, to diversify the world of wine and make it more accessible?
Well, I think truly the best way to do that is to try and see it as a less hierarchical place than we're accustomed to seeing it. I think that's one of the the other big negatives of this kind of hierarchy that we're having shoved down our throats with the points scheme the whole time. You know, we all assume that the only exquisite aesthetic experiences you can have are with wines that, you know, score 96 points and above, but that's ridiculous. You know, you can have an exquisite aesthetic experience with a Picpoul de Pinet under the right circumstances. You know, or you know, a bottle of Madiran, which need only cost 15 or 20 bucks, rather than, you know, rather than 200 or 300. So to me, the best way to combat that problem, if you like, is to always emphasize difference, and to always say, even if we feel that for practical reasons we have to use points, yes, the points are there, but don't take it too seriously, and don't ever fall into the trap of thinking that there is this objective thing called excellence that means for all people under all circumstances, this particular 97-point wine is always better than this particular 89-point wine, because it isn't, and it won't be. There are circumstances and there are tasters and drinkers for whom the 89-point wine, if it's a category they like, and if it's the moment that they really wanted to come to that wine, and if they're prepared to imaginatively engage with it, it'll be far, far better than the 97-point wine. So just don't take the damn points too seriously.
Do you find that philosophy comes into conflict when you're judging wines yourself, like with the Decanter World Wine Awards? Does that feel like what you want for the wine world is in direct conflict with organizations you're part of?
Not really, because, you know, I've never said we should stop using points altogether. You know, I can see their practical value, as I said, as a shorthand for enthusiasm. And with something like Decanter World Wine Awards, where, you know, frankly, we're not looking at wines that are going to be costing $300 or $400 bucks a bottle, and we're not looking at Bordeaux class growth. We do occasionally get a Burgundy Grand Cru entered, but mostly, you know, we're looking at a very different order of wines. We're looking at hopeful wines, inexpensive wines, wines which people, you know, believe in and want to try and make a little headway on the market with. So you have to have some way of sorting all of that out. And if we were just to sort of use words and talk about it, we'd be there for a year and a half doing the judging. We can't afford to do that. We have to do it all in a week, 18,500 wines or whatever it is. So we do need the shorthand of points to help us get there. Although I would emphasize that, you know, one of the things we always stress with the Decanter or World Wine Awards judging process is that the discussion is more important, in fact, than the awarding of the scores. Yes, I mean, you sit down with a flight of wines and you give them scores and you write notes on them, but then you stop and then you discuss. And it's never true that the wines that had the highest points total at the end of that process, you know, are in exactly the same hierarchy as after the discussion. Discussion always moves everything on. And that's when you get the chance to explore and exchange and share opinions and relook at things. Almost, you can't drink, of course, because practically it's not possible, but to sort of see things in that light, if you want, with a second or a third sip. And you know, the scores we arrive at the end of the flight are really scores that have been, as it were, tested and probed a little bit. And I think that's quite important too. So you know, I'm not too worried about that. I would always, as it were, defend points on as a practical aid. But what I'm always saying is, don't assume that the hierarchy is absolute. It isn't, and don't assume that excellence, as identified by a point score, is absolutely true for all people in all time. That's not true either. And we would always emphasize that in the way we wrote those wines up.
I love that thought. In your book, I think you talk about grape varieties, and you alluded to this earlier, that I think people aren't always familiar with. I guess more people now are familiar with Picpoul de Pinet, but you talk about Terroir from Croatia. Are there other either regions that you've come to know recently, grape varieties that you're newly excited about, winemakers that you think are just doing really interesting things that you think should be on the radar of more students of wine?
Yes, I mean, there's lots and lots of that for sure. That's the wonderful thing again about the wine world. It's always changing. It's always, modulating, and people are never standing still. They're always working and discovering and interpreting. So there are lots and lots of things like that, for sure. But examples. What should we choose? I'm a great fan of Southwest France, for example, which is a region of France which is really very little known by people in general, and often kind of completely overlooked when it comes to regional coverage of France, because it's very heterogeneous and it's scattered, and the regions that constitute Southwest France are often quite small regions. But to me, there's so much joy and discovery to be made in that particular part of France. I'm always really happy to sit down and to be able to taste wines from places like Jurançon or Irouléguy or Madeiran or Cahors as well. Bergerac even. Poor Bergerac suffers so much because it has to work with the Bordeaux varieties, but it is a different place. It's in the Dordogne, it's upriver. Things do work differently and taste differently there. So that, all of that is super interesting. We just mentioned a little bit about Croatia. I mean, to me, one of the really exciting adventures in the wine world at the moment is, we used to have this thing we called Eastern Europe, which was never a very exact description. Truly, it's Central Europe, mostly. Going off to the east, increasingly now with climate change and new climate possibilities. But there's really so much to be discovered in regions or countries like Croatia and Slovenia, and Romania increasingly, Bulgaria too, and on into the Caucasus in places like Armenia and Georgia. And in Turkey too, there are some wonderful Turkish wines. So all of that sort of previous area that was just sort of lumped aside as being, further to the east than any of the countries we were familiar with, I think is a very happy hunting ground for excellence and discovery as well. And then, of course, outside Europe, there are all the exciting things that are happening in the newer regions of California, for example, or up in Ontario or British Columbia, Okanagan, those sort of places. They're fascinating for me. Big fan of the wines from Ontario, for example, which are often very subtle and very nuanced and very drinkable. Not necessarily wines that are going to blow you over when you taste them, but when you sit down and drink with them, they can be really terrific. Chardonnay in particular. But other varieties like Gamay are now looking very interesting from there as well. On into South America, I'm a big fan of the wines that are coming from Argentina, and there's a sort of cultural revolution underway in Argentina at the moment with people thinking about terroir much more and thinking about nuance and subtlety and what high altitude really might mean. But those are super interesting. We could go on and on. That wherever you look, turn a stone or two over and you'll find super interesting things happening underneath it. That again is something else I hope the book encourages people to do, to look off the beaten track. Of course, the classics are wonderful, and I enjoy a nice bottle of Bordeaux as much as anybody. But there is an awful lot else out there to discover.
You mentioned the country of Georgia, and we have someone on our staff who is very much into Georgian wines. And
Fantastic.
So she had asked how you feel about sort of grape varieties that we don't necessarily think of as our international grape varieties, something like Saperavi that is starting to gain international traction. And I also wanted to ask you about, in one of the parts of your book, you talked about people being less married to varietal wines, to these varieties that they think they like, or styles that they think they like. How do you see something like Saperavi changing its perception in the world and on the kind of the world stage, as we start to see some of these great varieties that maybe we weren't familiar with before, but are starting to have more of an international reputation?
Well, there are really two questions there. Just let me quickly answer the second one first. The way that we attach perhaps too much importance to variety. I mean, I think once you start to compare honestly and openly the same variety grown in different places of the world, it becomes completely obvious very quickly that what you're tasting is more the place than the variety.
Mhm.
You know, the example I use in one of the essays, which is called Of Jellyfish and Guardsmen, was a Tanat, you know, tasted from Central Valley in California, and tasted from Uruguay, and tasted from down in Madiran, or up in Irulagi indeed as well. You know, these are three completely different experiences, which, and if you put them all side by side, you think, well, what's the point in talking about this as a varietal experience? You're much better off talking about what we can taste from Uruguay, what we can taste from Madiran or from Irulagi, or what we can taste, you know, when somebody tries to put a particular variety in a particular place in California. So I do think that we tend to over-ascribe significance to variety and under-ascribe significance to place. Now, your other question about Saperavi, for example, and about some of the other wonderful Georgian varieties, like Rakatsiteli and like Kisi and Mustvane and so on. Yeah, I'm a huge enthusiast for all of those. In fact, the next significant piece of wine travel I'll be doing in under a month will be to Tbilisi, to take part in something we haven't been able to hold since COVID happened, but we're looking forward to getting going again this year, which is the International Saperavi competition. Obviously, Georgia is super proud of its Saperavi, and with reason, but there are also people experimenting with Saperavi in various other places around the world, and it's fun to taste those alongside the Georgian ones to sort of see the differences and try and understand the variety a bit more intimately. To me, Saperavi is a great example of, you know, a variety which we could truly do exciting things with in the long run, I believe. Although until it's a bit more widely planted, that has to remain theoretical, because not all varieties travel well. You know, Nebbiolo is a difficult traveler. Sangiovese is a fairly difficult traveler, whereas varieties like the French varieties tend to travel more easily for one reason or another, although not particularly Merlot, I don't think. Anyway, back to Saperavi, you know, I'm a big fan of, of varieties with red varieties. I mean, there's another, well, actually several pieces in the book about tannin as such, because I am a big fan of tannin. It's a bit bold to put it like that. I don't just mean the more tannin, the better, because they have to be the right sort of tannins. But to me, when you're talking about red wine, often the personality and sometimes even the profundity of a wine is something that I'm convinced is hiding in the skins as much as in the juice, and probably more in the skins than the juice, and even in the stems as well. And so until wines have had the chance to have a proper conversation with their skins and their stems and their pips, and what the potential that's there has been expressed fully and unhurriedly, you know, they won't really have a chance to be what they could be. So I'm a big fan of wines which do have significant structure and tannic presences, as long as they've been, you know, intelligently extracted and well grown in the vineyard in the first place. And of course, Saperavi is very definitely falls into that category. It can be a bit terrifying when you first come across it if you're not, you don't quite realize what you're in for, because it can be exceedingly polyphenolically generous when it's in its youth. But interestingly, it does age quite quickly and quite dramatically. And what seems like, you know, almost a scarily tannic young Saperavi can age within 5-7 years into something that's much softer and more drinkable. It does that more quickly, for example, than Nebbiolo does, or than Tanat does. So yeah, to me, it's you know, all varieties are tools. Or if you want to use the musical analogy, they're instruments. You know, the music is the terroir, the winemaker's the performer, and the variety is the instrument. And I think Saperavi will be a very, very interesting instrument to use to try and bring out the music of places where we haven't had a chance to do that yet in the long run.
This seems to dovetail nicely with the conversation about climate, and how climate change is really, you know, altering our idea of what a place produces, what the character of a place is, you know, that sense of terroir and that taste of the place. And kind of a silver lining to climate change, but there are exciting developments kind of all over the world with new growing regions and, great varieties that we haven't been able to see in certain places before. I wonder if there are any areas that you are particularly excited about that are not traditional wine growing regions, but are starting to kind of come onto our map right now.
Yeah, well, the logical one to talk about there is the UK, my birthplace.
That's what I would say, but
but where the sparkling wines can be enormously convincing and very exciting. And by the way, some of the still wines now, there's some beautiful still Chardonnays coming out of the vineyards of southern UK at the moment as well. So that would be a good example. And of course, if you go to a place like Poland, I mean, Poland now has, forget the exact figure, but 100 wineries plus. I used to go to Poland in the 1980s quite a lot for personal reasons, and the idea that you'd be making wine in Poland back then was like off the charts crazy. I mean, you could make it from country fruits, but you'd never get grapes ripe, wine grapes ripe. And now it's possible, and ditto in Scandinavia, and even ditto in Latvia, where I go from time to time to do some judging as well. So all of the impossible or extremely difficult places are beginning to be feasible. And I should also say that because most of Europe's great classic wines, perhaps we should say most of France's great classic wines tended to be produced historically towards the northern limits of ripening for those varieties, because that was true. Rather unfairly, France's fine wine scene so far has benefited from climate change, it would seem, in that on aggregate, those wonderful vintages that used to be so hard to get hold of, maybe once in a decade or twice if you were lucky, are now coming 4 or 5 times in a decade, even more. So we seem to be in a sort of Goldilocks zone for those particular lucky farmers at the moment. But of course, we also have to remember that, the Horn of Africa has just had 5 failed rainy seasons. A couple of months ago, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater. So, there is also a terrible price to be paid by farmers who have no resource at all. So the way that, the lucky rich wine farmers of France are benefiting so far, and those in more vulnerable places around the world are suffering, is really a terrible injustice. Nonetheless, that seems to be the way it is at the moment. So, we as wine drinkers are sort of benefiting from it. But I think it would be idle to assume that it's going to stay that way forever. It's on the increase. We've already we're heading for a degree and a half. We're going to have a degree and a half, whatever happens, I think. The only question is, can we avoid 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees before we can finally get our carbon under control in the atmosphere? So worse is to come, and it's perfectly possible that the sort of Goldilocks zone that we're in at the moment will draw to an end a little bit later in the 2020s, and the 2030s will be a much less happy decade for the world's wine producers. So we have to bear that in mind, and use that as a spur, as if there weren't spurs enough to really grapple seriously with this problem.
It's a completely sobering thought to think that, I mean, obviously, everything with climate change is so much more serious than the world of wine, let's face it. But it's such a sobering thought to think that we're looking at 1 to 2 decades out, which just isn't very long, and massive, massive changes.
Yeah.
We did a little wine camp this summer that Kim and I led down to Long Island, of all places.
Wow.
And we're there very successfully growing Bordeaux varieties. And I think we were all expecting the wines to have had gotten a lot better than they had from 15 years ago. But I think we were shocked by the climate, how it's changed, how it's allowed just deep, rich, luscious wines to come out of that area. It was really a wonderful surprise.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I had a couple of different thoughts while you were talking about Saperavi actually before, and you had talked about the shock of Saperavi and how it was not for the fearless. It really reminded me of the story you wrote, actually, that ended up becoming the title of this book, about drinking young vintage port. And I thought maybe you would like to return to that, since that is, in fact, the title of the book.
Yeah, well, I should probably say at this point that, not all of the pieces in the book are deadly serious. I do try and be as lighthearted as I can be, because that's also part of wine too. So this is a fairly lighthearted piece. But yeah, I mean, I've always been a super fan, really, for a long, long time, about tasting and drinking vintage port in its earliest youth, which is when you're not used to it, or when you first come to it, is a fairly shocking experience. The metaphor being, it's rather like the ride of the Valkyries, or meeting a Valkyrie. Valkyries were the choosers of the slain, so if one came walking around the corner, you'd know your number was up. Fairly terrifying experience. So it can seem like a fairly terrifying experience, but I do think it is one of the great experiences that any human being can have with smelling and tasting something liquid, is young vintage port, because it is so powerful, so explosive, so full, so rich, so multi-layered, so completely uncompromising. And simply to sort of put it down in a cellar and wait 30 years until it sort of tastes like a really, really good ruby port is a bit of a shame. So I would truly urge anybody who has a bit of vintage port at home, if you have a case, or even if you have half a case, you must drink at least one bottle when it's still very young, because otherwise you'll be depriving yourself of one of the great wine experiences.
It's worth overcoming our terror.
It is, yeah.
I think at this point, Kim, we actually had a number of questions come in ahead of time when we said that we were going to talk to you. And I wonder, Kim, should we start to maybe delve into some of our students' questions for Andrew?
Sure.
Okay.
I've already talked about one, but we've got a few more as well.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. I'll come into one of this. Okay. You mentioned in one of your pieces that as we move to a more international wine scene, consumers are losing their attachment to varietals, which Kim mentioned. So how do we piggyback on this trend over the next century, looking at climate change resistant varieties that we are developing that consumers haven't even heard of yet? Do you think that they will be used to market wines? And do you think, essentially, this comes back to our climate change discussion and new varietals, do you think that there's a way of really changing the future of the wine market with those varietals?
Well, I do think that, but there is something standing in the way of that, which is appellation systems, as we had them in Europe, for example, which are very, firm and strict about sticking to the varieties you have, and even sticking to the blends you have sometimes in France as well. And to me, it's probably time we began to tear up all those rules and regulations and be much more creative about what we plant. And I do think it's based on a sort of fearfulness, almost, that, if you plant the wrong variety in a place, you'll lose the terroir. Well, that's not actually necessarily true. You might just see the terroir in a different light. You might see a facet of it that you'd never understood before. You might amplify your experience of what that place could be and what it has to offer. So I do think that we need to be much, much more flexible about what we plant where, and we need to be much more experimental. And in a way, climate change should act as a spur to us to do that. We should get on and do some of those experiments. They're sort of very tentatively beginning to think like that in France, but it needs to go a lot further and a lot faster, actually, than it is at the moment. And I think actually climate change will force that upon us fairly swiftly too. So I do think that probably in a decade's time, those rules and regulations will look rather different, and that will be a good thing.
Yeah, I think they're already changing. Certainly in Bordeaux, they're already changing, and as in other parts of France.
But perhaps I just would say one other thing about that. I mean, obviously, once you get outside Europe and get away from all the European appellations, you have a lot more freedom, and that's great, and that's fine. But there's another thing swings into view at that point, which is that you also need to always, and this is very important, respect the raw materials, and particularly respect the chemical integrity of the raw materials. In other words, you know, let's take a couple of varieties that I love a lot, like Gewürztraminer and Yonyi, two very sort of scented varieties, which at their best, you know, in the places that we come to know them best for, are sort of wonderfully overwhelming, sensual, unique experiences. We could go on a lot more about that, but let's just leave it at that for the moment. Very often when those varieties are planted in other places, the winemakers are sort of uncomfortable with letting them be the way they are, and they want to, you know, they're worried about the wrong pH, or they're worried that they won't have enough acid balance or something like that. So they will correct for those things. And that to me is a completely pointless activity, because you've then scrubbed away any sort of terroir character you could have. You're then, it's an industrial process at that point. So to me, it's great that varieties in places where people have total freedom, people are experimenting a lot with new varieties. That's fantastic. But all I would say is that for that experiment to be worthwhile, you must respect the chemical integrity. You must harvest ripe fruit. You grow the best fruit you can, harvest it ripe, full phenolic ripeness, and then live with the consequences. And that's truly the most educative way of learning about what might or might not work in your area.
Let's lean into that thought then, I think, with another question, which is sort of an interesting thought idea anyway. If a good Napa winemaker harvested grapes from a fine Burgundy vineyard and flew them immediately to his California winery where he vinified them, would the resultant wine more resemble Burgundy or California wine?
Well, it's a lovely thought, and there have been a few experiments of that sort actually done once or twice. The answer is it would probably taste more like a Burgundy than it would a California wine, but it wouldn't taste exactly like it would in Burgundy, because assuming you're using indigenous yeast, for example, the yeast population would be slightly different. And of course, you know, even if the winemaker tried to reproduce Burgundian practices as far as possible, probably some practical aspects of the vinification process would be different too. The vessels would be different. The ambient temperature would be different. The air pressure would be different. There'd be a whole suite of things operating on the wine which are different. That's the complexity of terroir for you. I think it's a great error to ever assume that terroir is just soil and nothing else. It's way, way more than that. And so, you know, yes, it'll be more like a Burgundy than it will be like a California wine. But even so, it won't be quite like the same wine would have been in Burgundy.
I think I tend to agree with you, though I also worry about those grapes, those grapes coming over in the first place, I have to say.
Yeah, well, the journey is another matter.
Let's talk about terroir, because you talk about it extensively in the book, not just with wine. You talk about it a little bit with whiskey, and you have a whole chapter on tea. So maybe we could focus a little bit on tea or other agricultural crops that really do express terroir and have cultural significance in the way that wine does.
Yeah, well, you know, tea is a wonderful analogy, and to me it explains why the Chinese culture and people who are living in China and have all that wonderful tea culture to draw on can easily understand the wine world, because they already understand terroir, because that's exactly the way tea works. The differences between the two are that wine is made from a fruit, tea is a leaf, so that immediately means that you need different climate to grow the greatest examples, because you don't grow great leaves with bright sunshine, and you don't grow great fruit with, well, some fruits, but not grapes at any rate with cloudy, humid weather. But after that, you know, both products are using a single variety, Vitis vinifera in the case of wine, and Commedia sinensis in the case of tea. And you then have a whole suite of different cultivars, and then you have a whole enormous panoply of different processing techniques. And that's exactly what you have in wine, and it's exactly what you have in tea. And you know, the richness of China tea culture, over 1,000 different types of teas, coming from different places in China, from different cultivars of Camellia sinensis, and using different processing techniques is exactly like the wine world. To me, they're perfectly complementary. Indeed, they're even complementary in a consuming sort of sense as well, which, in other words, you know, when you've had enough tea, it's probably time for a glass of wine. And when you've had enough wine, it's probably time to have a cup of tea. That's sort of the way I try and run my life, with a bit of sleep in between. So yeah, I mean, I think that they are very, very similar products, and they work in a completely similar way. And I would urge anybody who's listening to this who hasn't yet experimented and discovered some of the wonderfully rich world of tea to take a look, because very often wine people, once they discover that world, are super enthusiastic about tea as well.
Well, I'm a hardcore tea drinker. I know Kim is as well. And we're lucky here to have really decent importers that bring in all sorts of great stuff. So we're lucky to have that. But of course, unlike wine, which might be grown more and more in New England, I don't see tea being grown here anytime soon, which is truly just as well. So I think as we're starting to wrap up, and I know that a couple more questions are coming in, let's sort of get back to your book and focusing on your book and how you write. So one question that's come in is how you do write and what your process is like. And if you have the ability to decide what you're writing about, how do you decide what you want to write about with this great big world of wine?
Excellent questions. Well, I'm lucky enough now, most of my writing is columns. So I'm allowed to write about whatever I want to write about. So that is a big privilege, and it took me a long while to get there, and I'm very sort of thrilled to have got there. How do I decide what to write about? Well, it all goes back to imagination. I always want something to stimulate the imagination, or to shock or to surprise or startle in some way or another. I don't want to lecture people. I want to discover. So there has to be something I can write about in which I can go on a little journey or voyage of discovery with the reader. That's quite important too. And then when it comes to the actual process, you know, I worked for 4 years as an editor in publishing, having previously studied great literature at university for 6 years. And I was working for a mass market publisher, you know, just very ordinary books on ordinary subjects, cars, cats, dreams, golf, cooking, that sort of stuff. So I wasn't working on great literature when I was in publishing. And very often the people that would be asked to write those books were sort of celebrities in one way or another. And they'd say, oh, yes, you know, great, love to write a book. Yeah, I've never written a book. That's fantastic. And then I'd get a phone call about a week before the manuscript was due, and I'd hear them say, look, I'm having a bit of a struggle here. And I'd have to sort of try and help rescue their crashed manuscript. And I spent most of those 4 years taking really badly written sentences, tearing them to pieces and putting them back together properly. And this was a hugely useful experience. I'm very grateful for it, because I learned far more about how to write well in the 4 years that I did rescuing car crash sentences than I ever did in 6 years of reading Shakespeare and Milton and James Joyce and T.S. Eliot, much as I love those writers. And so when I write, I always try and write as much in advance of the deadline as I can. And at any rate, enough time so I can work on what I've written, and often that requires quite a lot of revision, and then print it out and chuck it in a heap and forget about it, and only go back to it when I've completely forgotten what it was I wrote. And then I go back in, and then I can hit it like an editor. And that is a very useful and valuable process as far as I'm concerned, because often, well, always actually, what you end up with at the end of that process, painful though it may be, is better than what you would have had if you just dashed it off and sent it off to the editor.
That must take a lot of discipline.
It does,
to
yeah.
be able to do it that way.
Does. And drawing up of lists and looking at diaries and fretting and waking up at 4 a.m. thinking, geez, I haven't done that yet. Got to get on with that. Yeah.
We had a question come in sort of at a similar topic about how you write differently for different audiences. So people who maybe are just wine enthusiasts but don't have the depth of knowledge to even know what a wine from Savoie has, anything to do versus,
Yeah.
experts that maybe have a little bit more knowledge.
Yeah, well, that's very important, and it's very important that you do that. And maybe I've sort of indicated that already in talking a little bit about education. I do try to cultivate sympathy with the student or sympathy with the reader. I try to provide pleasure for the reader. And in order to do that effectively, you have to start from the place the reader is starting from. Now, obviously, if you're writing for World of Fine Wine, that's a very different prospect to writing for a magazine I used to write for, which was called Waitrose Food Illustrated. It was, in other words, a UK supermarket magazine. And the people who are reading that magazine would start from a very different place compared to the people that were reading World of Fine Wine, or indeed Financial Times, because for 18 years I used to cover for Jancis Robinson in the summer in the Financial Times. So again, you could take certain things for granted there that you can't take when you're writing even for Decanter magazine. So it's very important to always think about the reader and try and start from the place the reader is starting from, and then try and enjoy and discover with the reader at an appropriate level as you go through the piece. Very important thing to do.
I think that idea of meeting the student or meeting the reader at the place where they are is extremely valuable in being able to make wine, that subject that can be more approachable. Sometimes we deal with the snob factor or the fear factor of wine, because there is so much and it can be so broad. And I feel like we often wrestle with where do we start? For people who like to drink wine but maybe don't know anything about it, sometimes they'll come to us and be like, I don't even know where to begin. And so meeting them on that level that they're at can be very valuable, both as an educator, and just someone who is a wine enthusiast who just, maybe talks too much about wine with their friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think what you do show consistently in this book, though, is your great ability for storytelling. And I think regardless of who your audience is, most people are very willing to be taken along a ride, a story that even if you're making references that they don't always understand, they definitely get behind the feeling that you have for your subject and the direction that you're taking them. And it's a wonderful ride, truly. So
thank you.
So do you have a favorite story from this book? I know the one that you had mentioned before about being in the Rhone certainly seems to be one, but do you have any other ones that are sort of
no, there are some other favorite stories as well. There's a piece called Angela's Lemon, which is about an experience I had in the extraordinary Italian vineyard of Cinque Terre. That would be one, just meeting this lady, actually tending her vines and tidying them up for autumn and so on, and talking to her about that. There's another one, quite a similar story in a way, called Up the Steep Hill, which is an experience I had in Austria's Wachau region, talking to a wine grower who'd bought a vineyard off an old lady and hearing her story. So that was quite important. And then, there's another one called Lucky Us, which is a very personal story, because even though it starts with a broader perspective, in the end, it's about my parents. My mum had Alzheimer's, my dad had prostate cancer and bone cancer, and they were sort of living autonomously for quite a long time with these illnesses. And I used to go and see them from time to time. And we would share wine, and often, my dad had bought it. It wasn't very good wine, but it was just about how wonderful it was to share wine with them under those circumstances, and how lucky we were still to have each other and still to have wine to drink together and be able to enjoy it together. So yeah, that's another example of that story. And what was more important? Was it the fact that the wine wasn't very good, or was it the fact that we were all together sharing it? Obviously, it was the fact we were all together sharing it, which was most important. So there's a few stories like that.
Yeah. Back to that theme of wine and joy.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
Just being able to share it with other people, and that's really where I think the most important bit is. And it does seem that the stories that you have in this book that have the most heart are the ones that involve other people, and not just the flavor of the wine in the glass or the history of the terroir, but the people behind it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess that's what we're all about anyway, isn't it?
Yeah.
We go down this road, but it doesn't really much matter without the people that we get to go with.
It's true. Yeah.
Do you have any other projects coming up that should be on our radar? What are you working on now?
Well, just working on keeping my head above water as usual. There's no other big project at the moment, but I have two sons. I haven't been able to work on books for some years because I haven't had the resources, and it's been important to be with them as much as possible. But they're now 15 and 17, so they're beginning to sort of inch towards autonomy. So I hope to move on to more book projects in such time as I have ahead of me. But there's nothing I can particularly tell you about at this stage, I'm afraid.
Well, we'll look forward to them as they come along, but certainly your articles as they come out monthly, we'll still read and enjoy. We're going to put in the chat the link to purchase your book, though I bet everybody here has already gotten it. Why wouldn't they? Drinking with the Valkyries. And let's see, I'm going to sneak that into the chat right this instant. Sending it to everybody. There you go. It's available also through the Académie du Vin Library, and wherever fine books are sold, I'm sure, but readily available, and a really, truly wonderful read. Andrew Jefford, thank you so much for being with us today. This has really been a great pleasure. And what I have to say, here in New England is one of our first cold, miserable, wet, stormy days. You were a ray of sunshine to spend the afternoon with, truly.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Kim. It's been great to spend time with you.
Thank you.
We're going to put the copy of this webinar up on our online platform. We'll get to it in the next couple of days. I'll certainly send you a link, Andrew, as well.
Lovely.
We're going to make widely available the link to purchase the book, which we recommend doing. And thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this webinar, for joining us today, and for spending a little time with us on your afternoon or evening, as it is for you, Andrew.
Okay. Thanks again, and bye, everybody.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.